The first crack of thunder rolled across the empty highway, just as Daniel Carter slammed the brakes hard enough to send his old pickup skidding sideways across the rain-soaked asphalt, the tires screaming against the road while 8-year-old Sophie cried out from the back seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit against her chest as headlights exploded through the darkness behind them. Daniel's hands trembled violently on the steering wheel, his breathing ragged, his entire body frozen in the horrifying realization that the black SUV chasing them wasn't slowing down anymore. It was accelerating. Water sprayed across the windshield while lightning split the Texas sky wide open, illuminating the face of the woman sitting beside him, soaked from the storm, pale with fear, staring back through the rear window as if she already knew exactly what was coming next. Then she whispered something that made Daniel's blood run cold. They found me. Before this story begins, take a second to like and subscribe, because sometimes the people we ignore on the side of the road are carrying battles we could never imagine, and sometimes one act of kindness can change the course of an entire life. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Carter had been sitting alone inside a nearly empty diner outside Amarillo, Texas, staring at a stack of overdue bills spread across the scratched wooden table while the neon open sign buzzed weakly against the front window. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, and the exhaustion hanging over Daniel felt so heavy it almost seemed visible. He looked older than 36. Years older. The deep shadows under his eyes and the roughness in his hands told the story of a man who had spent too many years fighting losing battles. Ever since his wife Melissa died from cancer 2 years earlier, life had slowly collapsed around him piece by piece, like a house rotting from the inside out. First came the hospital debt, then the foreclosure notices, then the construction company layoffs. Eventually, Daniel found himself working temporary, night shifts unloading freight trucks while trying to raise Sophie alone in a tiny rented trailer on the edge of town. And despite how hard he worked, it never seemed enough. The waitress quietly refilled his coffee before placing another unpaid receipt near the others. Daniel rubbed his face and forced a tired smile. And despite how hard he worked, it never seemed enough. The waitress quietly refilled his coffee before placing another unpaid receipt near the others. Daniel rubbed his face and forced a tired smile. "Thanks, Linda." Linda sighed softly. "Daniel, Earl said if the tab isn't paid by Friday, he's going to cut you off." Daniel nodded without looking up. "I know. You haven't eaten anything except toast for 3 days." "I'm fine." "No, honey," Linda said gently. "You're surviving." "That's different." Daniel stared out the rain-covered window toward the parking lot where Sophie sat inside the truck drawing smiley faces in the fogged-up glass. Even after losing her mother, the little girl somehow still carried pieces of joy inside her that Daniel himself no longer recognized. Sometimes he wondered if children were stronger than adults in ways nobody talked about. Then the diner door opened. A woman stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the floor beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked completely out of place there. Not because she wore expensive clothes, she didn't. In fact, her gray coat looked old and worn, and her dark hair was messy from the storm. But there was something about the way she carried herself, something quiet and controlled. Her eyes moved carefully around the room, like someone used to studying people before speaking. She looked exhausted, but not broken. The entire diner turned to glance at her before quickly looking away again. She approached the counter slowly. "Excuse me," she asked softly. "Is there somewhere nearby I can stay for the night?" Linda frowned apologetically. "Closest motel's about 20 miles east." The woman looked down for a moment, clearly hiding disappointment. Daniel noticed her hands trembling slightly from the cold. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him cautiously before nodding too quickly. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Even Sophie noticed. The little girl suddenly climbed out of the truck and rushed into the diner, carrying her small pink umbrella that barely worked anymore. "Daddy," Sophie whispered loudly, "that lady's freezing." Daniel gave an embarrassed smile while the woman looked surprised. Sophie walked directly toward her and held out the umbrella, like it was some priceless treasure. "You can borrow it." The woman stared at the child for several seconds, and something inside her expression cracked for just a moment. Not sadness exactly, more like someone remembering a feeling they thought they'd lost years ago. "Thank you," she whispered. "My mommy used to say umbrellas are supposed to be shared." Daniel's chest tightened instantly. The woman looked toward him carefully after hearing that. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Yeah." Outside, thunder rumbled again. Linda leaned closer toward Daniel and lowered her voice. "Earl's old storage room behind the diner is empty. Not much, but it's dry." Daniel looked toward the woman again. She seemed exhausted enough to collapse. "You can stay there tonight if you want," he said. Until the storm passes. For a second, she looked almost suspicious of kindness itself, like she'd spent too much time learning not to trust it. Then finally she nodded. My name's Claire. Daniel. Sophie, the little girl announced proudly. Claire smiled faintly. That night, rain hammered the roof of Daniel's trailer while Sophie slept curled against his side on the couch because the thunder scared her. Daniel sat awake near the window thinking about the strange woman behind the diner. Something about her stayed in his mind. Maybe it was the sadness in her eyes. Maybe it was how carefully she chose every word, like someone hiding entire pieces of themselves. Or maybe it was because for the first time in months, he had seen someone who looked even lonelier than he felt. The next morning, Daniel found Claire sitting outside the diner storage room, drinking black coffee while watching the sunrise over the empty Texas fields. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and silent. You heading somewhere? Daniel asked. Claire hesitated before answering. Honestly, I'm not sure anymore. Daniel leaned against the railing beside her. That bad? A small laugh escaped her, though there was no happiness in it. You ever spend so much time building a life that one day you wake up and realize none of it actually belongs to you? Daniel studied her face carefully. Yeah, he admitted quietly. I think I know that feeling. For the next few days, Claire stayed around town. She offered to help Linda inside the diner in exchange for meals. And surprisingly, customers seemed drawn to her calm presence. She listened when people spoke, really listened. Truck drivers told her stories they normally kept buried. Old ranchers stayed longer over coffee just to continue conversations with her. Even Earl, the bitter diner owner who trusted nobody, softened around her faster than anyone expected. But the strangest part was Sophie. The little girl became attached to Claire almost immediately. Daniel noticed how Sophie laughed more whenever Claire was nearby, how she talked more, smiled more. For months after Melissa's death, Sophie had carried quiet sadness like a shadow following her everywhere. But somehow Claire reached parts of her Daniel couldn't. One evening, while Daniel repaired a loose fence outside the trailer, he overheard Sophie speaking softly to Claire on the porch. Sophie? Claire asked gently. What do you miss most about your mom? There was a long silence. Her voice, Sophie whispered. I'm scared I'm forgetting it. Daniel froze. Claire looked heartbroken. Then she said something Daniel would never forget. People we love never really disappear, sweetheart. Sometimes they just become part of the way we see the world. Sophie looked up at her. What does that mean? Claire smiled sadly. It means your mom is still here every time you're kind to someone, every time you're brave when you're scared. Love leaves fingerprints on our lives. Daniel quietly turned away because suddenly he couldn't breathe properly anymore. That night after Sophie fell asleep, Daniel and Claire sat outside beneath the trailer's weak porch, light while crickets hummed in the darkness around them. You're good with her, Daniel said. Claire stared out toward the empty fields. I used to have a daughter. Daniel looked at her immediately. What happened? For the first time since meeting her, Claire seemed genuinely shaken. She died, she whispered. Daniel's heart sank. How old? 7. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel finally spoke softly. I'm sorry. Claire nodded faintly, but her eyes looked distant now, trapped somewhere far away. You know what the worst part is? She said quietly. People think grief gets smaller over time. It doesn't. You just get better at carrying it. Daniel stared at her for several seconds because those words felt too real to come from someone pretending. And that was when he first realized Claire was hiding much more than pain. Over the next week, strange things began happening. A sleek black SUV appeared near the diner twice, always parked far enough away to avoid attention. Claire would tense instantly whenever she noticed it. Once Daniel caught her secretly checking the rear view mirror every few minutes, during a grocery run like she expected someone to appear behind them. Then there were the phone calls. Claire owned an old flip phone she barely used. But late at night, Daniel sometimes noticed her standing alone outside staring at the screen, while it rang unanswered in her hand. One night he finally confronted her. Claire, who are you running from? She looked stunned. I'm not running. That's not true. Rain drizzled softly across the trailer roof, while tension thickened between them. You don't sleep, Daniel continued quietly. You flinch every time certain cars drive past. You look over your shoulder constantly, and whatever's on that phone scares you. Claire's eyes filled with emotion she struggled to contain. You're a good man, Daniel, she whispered. That's why you need to stop asking questions. Because I helped you? Because people close to me get hurt. Daniel stared at her. Then Sophie's sleepy voice echoed from inside the trailer. Daddy? Claire immediately wiped her tears away before Sophie could see. Daniel walked inside and found Sophie standing in the hallway, clutching her blanket. "I had a bad dream," she whispered. Claire knelt beside her instantly. "Want me to tell you a secret?" Claire asked gently. Sophie nodded. "When I'm scared, I imagine every person I love standing beside me like invisible. Superheroes." Sophie smiled weakly. "Even if they're gone?" Claire's voice cracked slightly. "Especially then." Later that same night, Daniel woke to headlights outside the trailer. He stepped cautiously toward the window and saw the black SUV parked across the road. Two men sat inside, watching the house. Daniel's stomach tightened. Then he noticed Claire standing frozen in the kitchen doorway behind him. Her face had turned completely pale. "Who are they?" Daniel demanded. Claire looked terrified. "We need to leave." "What?" "Right now." Before Daniel could respond, the SUV doors suddenly opened, and the men started walking toward the trailer through the rain. His heart began pounding so hard it almost drowned out the sound of the rain hitting the trailer roof. For one frozen second, nobody moved. The only light inside the trailer came from the flickering television in the corner and the weak, yellow bulb above the kitchen sink, casting long shadows across the cramped room while the two men outside approached slowly through the storm like they already knew. There was nowhere left to run. Sophie stood barefoot in the hallway clutching her blanket, confused by the fear suddenly filling the room. "Daddy, what's happening?" Daniel immediately crossed the room and knelt in front of her, forcing calm into his voice even though his hands were shaking. "I need you to do something for me, sweetheart," he whispered. "Go put your shoes on." "Right now." "But..." "Now, Sophie." Something in his tone made her obey without another question. Claire looked toward the front window again, panic spreading across her face as the men reached the porch steps. "They're faster than I thought," she whispered. Daniel stared at her. "Who are they?" Before she could answer, 3 hard knocks slammed against the trailer door. The entire room went silent. Another knock came, louder this time. Then a man's voice. "Ms. Bennett," he called calmly through the storm. "You know this won't help." Daniel looked at Claire instantly. "Bennett?" Claire closed her eyes briefly, like the name itself hurt to hear. Another voice joined the first one outside. "We're not here to hurt anyone. Open the door." Daniel stepped closer to Claire, lowering his voice. "Tell me the truth." "Right now." Claire looked at him with eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. "My name isn't Claire." Thunder shook the trailer walls. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. "What?" "My real name is Evelyn Bennett." The knocking came again. Harder, more impatient. Daniel's mind raced. None of this made sense anymore. The quiet woman who washed dishes at the diner and read bedtime stories to Sophie suddenly sounded like someone living inside a completely different world. Outside, one of the men spoke again. "Ms. Bennett, if you don't open this door, we'll have to escalate the situation." Daniel glanced toward the kitchen and grabbed the old baseball bat leaning beside the refrigerator. Evelyn immediately shook her head. "No, Daniel, don't. You expect me to let them walk in here? You don't understand who they are." "Then help me understand." Evelyn looked toward the hallway where Sophie was hurriedly struggling into her tiny sneakers. Then she whispered something that changed everything. "They work for me." Daniel stared at her like he'd misheard. "What?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "I own the company." The room fell completely silent except for the rain. Daniel blinked once, then twice. "What company?" Evelyn looked at him with tears building in her eyes. "Bennett International." Daniel felt like the floor had vanished underneath him. Everybody in Texas knew that name. Bennett International wasn't just another company. It was one of the largest corporate empires in America. Hotels, trucking chains, restaurants, energy contracts, luxury real estate. Their name was everywhere. The CEO, Evelyn Bennett, was practically a ghost in the media. Rarely photographed, rarely interviewed. People described her as brilliant, ruthless, untouchable. And now Daniel was standing inside a leaking trailer, beside a billionaire who had spent the last 2 weeks washing coffee cups at a roadside diner. Another loud knock interrupted the silence. "Ms. Bennett!" Daniel looked back toward the door, then toward Evelyn again. "You're telling me you're that Evelyn Bennett?" She nodded faintly. "I disappeared 3 weeks ago." Daniel's voice dropped. "Why?" For a moment, Evelyn couldn't answer. Her composure, the calm control she always carried, finally began to crack. "Because I was tired of living inside a world where nobody saw human beings anymore." The men outside were growing impatient now. One of them tried the doorknob. "Locked!" Daniel tightened his grip on the bat instinctively. Evelyn stepped closer. "Daniel, please listen to me carefully. Those men aren't dangerous. But if the media finds me here, your life and Sophie's life will never be normal again. You disappeared on purpose? Yes. Why would someone like you sleep in a diner storage room? Evelyn laughed softly through tears, but it sounded broken. Because for the first time in 15 years, nobody knew who I was. Daniel couldn't even process what he was hearing. Evelyn looked toward Sophie, whose frightened eyes moved between the adults without understanding. After my daughter died, Evelyn whispered, I buried myself inside work. I turned my entire life into meetings, acquisitions, numbers, endless expansion. Everybody around me kept praising me for becoming stronger. But the truth was, I stopped feeling like a person. Outside, the first man's tone hardened. Ms. Bennett, we know you're inside. Evelyn ignored him. I wanted to see what my company actually looked like from the ground level. Not from boardrooms, not from reports. Real life, real people. Her eyes met Daniel's. People like you. Daniel felt something twist painfully inside his chest. You were undercover. Yes. But the diner is owned by one of our restaurant subsidiaries. Daniel suddenly remembered the broken freezer Earl could never afford to repair. The unpaid overtime Linda constantly complained about. The cheap ingredients, the understaffing, and Evelyn had seen all of it herself. She looked ashamed now. I built an empire so large I stopped seeing the damage underneath it. Sophie slowly walked closer to Evelyn. You're rich? The little girl asked innocently. Despite everything happening, Evelyn smiled softly. I guess so. Then why were you sad all the time? The question hit harder than anything else in the room. Evelyn looked at the child for several long seconds before answering quietly. Because money can buy almost everything except the people you miss. Daniel saw her eyes water again, and suddenly none of this felt fake anymore. Outside, footsteps shifted on the porch. Then one of the men spoke more gently this time. Ma'am, your board is panicking. The media thinks you may have been kidnapped. Evelyn looked physically exhausted now, like the weight of her real identity had finally caught up to her. Daniel lowered the bat slowly. You should probably talk to them. But Evelyn's expression darkened immediately. You still don't understand. Daniel frowned. What? She looked terrified again. The board doesn't want me coming back. The realization hit him instantly. This isn't about protecting you. No, Evelyn whispered. It's about controlling the company. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating her face. My disappearance exposed things. Corruption, illegal layoffs, fraud hidden inside multiple divisions. Her voice shook now. I started investigating after seeing how workers were being treated. Some people inside the company realized I wasn't coming back quietly. Daniel felt cold suddenly. You think they'll hurt you? I know they will. Right then, Sophie gasped softly while staring out the side window. Daddy? Daniel turned. Another black SUV had just pulled onto the road behind the first one. Then another and another. Evelyn's face went completely white. That's not my security team. The fear in her voice was real, terrifyingly real. The men on the porch noticed the arriving vehicles, too. One of them suddenly reached for his earpiece. Move! He barked urgently toward his partner. Now! Everything exploded into motion. The porch agents rushed backward, just as three armed men stepped out of the arriving SUVs. Daniel's blood froze. Gunshots shattered through the rain. Sophie screamed. Daniel immediately grabbed her and dropped to the floor while glass exploded across the trailer living room. Evelyn ducked beside them as bullets ripped through the front window, the deafening sound filling the tiny trailer with chaos. Get down! One of the security men outside shouted. Daniel wrapped his body protectively over Sophie while her tiny hands clung desperately to him. The trailer lights suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed everything except flashes of lightning and gunfire outside. Evelyn's breathing was ragged beside him. They found me first, she whispered in horror. Another shot blasted through the kitchen cabinets. Daniel looked toward Evelyn furiously. What the hell is happening? She looked devastated. The board hired private contractors to stop me before I could expose them. You're saying your own company wants you dead? Yes. Outside, tires screeched violently. Someone shouted. Another gunshot echoed through the storm. Daniel realized something horrifying then. This wasn't some corporate disagreement anymore. This was survival. One of the security agents suddenly burst through the trailer door. Ms. Bennett, he yelled. We have to move right now. The man was bleeding from his shoulder. Daniel stared at him. Who are you? Secret Service detail contracted through Bennett Executive Protection. Daniel blinked in confusion. Secret Service? Evelyn finally looked at him directly. My company supplies infrastructure systems to federal agencies. The trailer shook from another impact outside. The wounded agent turned urgently toward Evelyn. Ma'am, they're trying to cut off the road. Daniel's survival instincts kicked in instantly. There's an old service route behind the fields, he said quickly. Leads toward Highway 40. The agent nodded. We move now. Rain exploded against them the moment they ran outside. The night felt like pure chaos. The first SUV burned near the roadside while one of the attackers lay unconscious beside the ditch. Daniel held Sophie tightly against his chest as they sprinted through mud toward another vehicle waiting behind the trailer. Evelyn stumbled briefly in the rain and Daniel caught her arm. For a moment their eyes locked, and Daniel saw something he never expected to see in one of the most powerful women in America. Fear. Real fear. Not for money, not for power, for her life. The agent opened the SUV door. Go! Daniel shoved Sophie inside first. Evelyn climbed in beside her while Daniel jumped into the passenger seat. The SUV roared across the muddy field just as headlights burst through the darkness behind them. They're coming! Sophie cried. Daniel turned. 3 black vehicles were racing after them through the storm. The driver cursed under his breath and accelerated harder across the uneven terrain, while rain hammered the windshield. So violently it became almost impossible to see. Then Sophie suddenly whispered something small and trembling from the back seat. Daddy, are we gonna die? Daniel turned around immediately. No, he said firmly, though his voice cracked slightly. No, sweetheart. But the truth was he wasn't sure anymore. The pursuing headlights grew closer behind them. And somewhere deep inside Daniel Carter, the terrifying realization finally settled in. Helping one lonely woman on a rainy night had just dragged him and his daughter into a war between billionaires powerful enough to erase people without consequences. And the worst part, he still didn't know who he could trust. The SUV bounced violently across the muddy service road, while rain hammered the roof hard, enough to sound like gunfire. Sophie sat curled against Evelyn in the back seat, crying silently into her blanket, while flashes of lightning lit up the dark. Texas fields around them in brief, terrifying bursts. Behind them, the black vehicles continued tearing through the storm, their headlights cutting through the rain like predators closing in on wounded prey. Daniel gripped the dashboard tightly as the driver pushed the SUV faster over the uneven ground. Who are these people? Daniel shouted over the storm. The security agent kept his eyes fixed ahead. Mercenaries, private contractors, most likely hired through shell companies, connected to Bennett International's board. Daniel turned toward Evelyn in disbelief. You're telling me your own executives are trying to kill you because you found corruption? Evelyn looked shattered now. Nothing like the untouchable billionaire the world imagined. You don't understand how much money is involved, she whispered. The labor fraud alone could destroy half the company. Daniel stared at her. You really had no idea what was happening. Evelyn's eyes filled with guilt. I built something so massive I stopped seeing the people at the bottom. I trusted reports instead of human beings. I believed profits meant success. She swallowed hard. Then I met people like Linda, Earl, you. Another flash of lightning illuminated the pain in her face, and I realized my company was crushing the very people who kept it alive. The SUV suddenly swerved sharply as bullets shattered the rear windshield. Sophie screamed. Down! The agent yelled. Glass exploded across the seats, while Daniel twisted around protectively, covering Sophie with his body. Evelyn immediately pulled the child against her chest, shielding her head with both arms while the driver accelerated harder. They're gaining! The agent shouted into his radio. Static crackled back, then another voice. Bridge ahead is compromised. Do not take Route 40. The driver cursed violently. They blocked the highway. Daniel's mind raced desperately. He knew these back roads better than anyone. Years of construction work had taken him across half the county. There's an abandoned cattle ranch about 5 miles east, he said quickly. Old storm shelter underground. The driver looked at him. Can it hold? Maybe. Evelyn stared at Daniel with surprise. You know the area that well. Daniel laughed bitterly. When you're poor, you learn every back road in Texas. The SUV hit another deep rut, nearly throwing them sideways. Behind them, headlights bounced wildly through the storm, still following. Sophie clung tightly to Evelyn now, trembling uncontrollably. Evelyn brushed wet hair gently away from the little girl's face. Hey, she whispered softly. Look at me. Sophie's watery eyes lifted slowly. You remember what I told you about invisible superheroes? Sophie nodded weakly. Well, right now your mommy's beside you. Evelyn smiled gently despite the fear surrounding them. And so am I. Daniel looked back at them for a moment and felt something ache deep inside his chest. Sophie looked safer in Evelyn's arms than she had looked in months. There was warmth there, protection, the kind Melissa used to give her before cancer stole, the light from their lives. And that realization scared Daniel almost as much as the men chasing them. The SUV finally veered off the road toward a cluster of broken fences and dead trees barely visible through the rain. Ahead, the silhouette of an abandoned ranch house appeared against the storm-dark sky like some forgotten ghost left to rot in the middle of nowhere. "We stop here," Daniel said. The SUV slid sideways through mud before stopping hard beside the collapsing barn. "Move!" the agent barked. They ran through freezing rain toward the ranch house, while thunder cracked overhead. The old floorboards groaned beneath their feet as Daniel led them through the dark interior toward a rusted cellar door hidden beneath torn carpet. He pulled it open. Cold air rose from the darkness below. "Everybody down." The storm shelter smelled like dirt, rust, and old wood. Tiny beams of flashlight light shook across concrete walls while rain echoed faintly above them. Sophie sat wrapped in a dusty blanket while Evelyn knelt beside her, trying to calm her breathing. The wounded security agent pressed fabric against his bleeding shoulder. Daniel finally snapped. "Enough." Everyone looked toward him. "I brought a stranger home because she looked lonely," he said, his voice shaking with anger and exhaustion. "Now armed men are trying to kill my daughter. So somebody better start telling me the full truth." Silence filled the shelter. Then Evelyn slowly nodded. "You deserve that." She sat against the concrete wall, looking smaller somehow without the mask she'd worn around the diner. "My daughter's name was Lily," she began quietly. "She died in a car accident 6 years ago." Daniel listened silently. "I was in a meeting when it happened. My husband called me 13 times. Her voice cracked slightly. "I ignored every call because I was negotiating a merger." Sophie looked up at her sadly. "When I finally answered..." Evelyn stopped speaking for several seconds, struggling to continue. "They told me she was already gone." The storm rumbled faintly overhead. Evelyn stared down at her shaking hands. "After that, I stopped being human for a while. I buried myself in work because numbers were easier than grief. I built Bennett International into something enormous because success distracted me from guilt." Tears rolled quietly down her face now. "But grief doesn't disappear. It waits." Daniel felt his anger softening despite himself. Evelyn looked toward Sophie. "Then 3 weeks ago, I visited one of our warehouse sites undercover. A worker collapsed from exhaustion during a double shift. Nobody even stopped production." Her jaw tightened painfully. "He died before the ambulance arrived." Daniel stared at her. "And the company covered it up?" She nodded. That was the moment everything changed. The wounded agent finally spoke. She began investigating internally, quietly, off the books. Evelyn continued. "The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Illegal layoffs, payroll theft, bribed inspectors, unsafe working conditions. Entire communities destroyed while executives collected bonuses." Her eyes darkened. "Some of the people responsible sit on my own board." Daniel leaned against the wall, trying to absorb all of it. "So why disappear?" Evelyn gave a tired smile. "Because I wanted to remember what normal people felt like." She looked directly at him now. "And because nobody tells the truth to a billionaire." Silence settled heavily through the shelter. Then Sophie suddenly asked the question nobody else would. "Why did you stay with us?" Evelyn's face softened instantly. "Because your dad reminded me there are still good people left in the world." Daniel looked away uncomfortably. Evelyn continued quietly. "Most people see someone stranded in the rain and keep driving." Your father stopped. Daniel swallowed hard. He barely had enough money to feed himself. Evelyn whispered to Sophie. And he still shared what little he had. The little girl looked proudly toward her father. Daniel felt emotion tightening painfully in his throat. Then the agent's radio crackled violently. Everyone froze. A voice burst through the static. They found the ranch. Fear swept instantly through the shelter. "How far?" the wounded agent demanded. "Less than 2 minutes." The agent cursed and grabbed his weapon. Daniel's pulse exploded. "There's another exit," he said quickly. "Old drainage tunnel behind the shelter." The agent nodded sharply. "Move now." Panic returned immediately. Rainwater dripped through cracks in the ceiling, while footsteps thundered faintly above them now. They were already here. Daniel grabbed Sophie while Evelyn helped the injured agent stand. Then suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed directly overhead. Someone had entered the ranch house. Sophie buried her face against Daniel's chest. Voices moved above them, muffled, searching. The agent led them toward the narrow drainage tunnel at the rear of the shelter, but halfway there, Evelyn stopped moving. Daniel turned. "What are you doing?" She looked frozen. "I can't keep dragging you into this." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "You think this stops if you surrender?" "At least they'll leave you and Sophie alone." The agent shook his head immediately. "No, ma'am, they won't." Evelyn looked horrified because she already knew he was right. Daniel stepped closer to her. "Listen to me carefully," he said. My wife spent 2 years dying in hospitals while insurance companies argued over coverage. I worked myself half to death trying to save her. His eyes locked onto hers. People with money made those decisions too. Evelyn looked devastated. So no, Daniel continued quietly. I'm not walking away from this. For a second, she looked like she might completely fall apart emotionally. Then footsteps pounded directly above the shelter. A voice shouted, "Check downstairs." The agent immediately motioned toward the tunnel. "Go!" They crawled into darkness just as the cellar door burst open behind them. Flashlights sliced through the shelter. Men shouted. The tunnel was barely large enough to move through. Dirt and mud soaked their clothes while thunder echoed faintly above. Sophie whimpered quietly as Daniel carried her through the narrow passage. Behind them, voices grew louder. "They went through here!" The attackers had found the tunnel. Daniel's heart pounded harder. The injured agent stopped suddenly and handed Evelyn a small flash drive from inside his jacket. She stared at it. "The files?" she whispered. He nodded. "Everything you uncovered." Daniel realized then this tiny piece of metal was worth killing for. The agent looked directly at Evelyn. "If anything happens to me, expose them." Emotion filled her face. "Tom." But before she could finish, gunshots exploded through the tunnel behind them. The agent collapsed instantly. Sophie screamed. Daniel turned in horror while Evelyn dropped beside the wounded man. Blood spread rapidly beneath him. "Go!" Tom shouted painfully. "Now!" Evelyn looked shattered. "I'm not leaving you. You have to finish this." More gunshots echoed closer. Tom grabbed Daniel's arm desperately. "Protect them." Then he shoved them forward. Daniel pulled Evelyn away while tears streamed down her face. The tunnel sloped upward ahead toward a rusted drainage gate, barely visible through the rain outside. Behind them, footsteps closed in fast. Tom raised his weapon one final time inside the darkness. Then the tunnel erupted with gunfire, and his voice disappeared forever. Rain exploded across the open drainage ditch as Daniel dragged Sophie through the rusted gate and out into the freezing Texas night, his chest burning from exhaustion while Evelyn stumbled beside him with tears mixing into the rain on her face. Behind them, muffled gunfire still echoed from inside the tunnel, each shot sounding farther away now, but somehow heavier, final, permanent. The storm swallowed the last sounds of Agent Tom's resistance, leaving only thunder and the terrifying realization that a man had just sacrificed his life so they could escape. For several seconds, none of them spoke. They simply ran. Mud pulled at their shoes while lightning flashed across the empty fields surrounding the abandoned ranch. Daniel could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but survival pushed him forward anyway. Sophie clung tightly to his neck, trembling violently from fear and cold, while Evelyn carried the small flash drive inside her clenched fist like it was the last fragile piece of truth left in the world. Then headlights appeared ahead. Daniel instantly froze. Another SUV sat parked near the tree line. His pulse exploded again. Evelyn stopped breathing for a moment. "We need to turn back." But the driver's door suddenly opened, and an older man stepped into the rain holding no weapon at all. He wore a dark overcoat soaked by the storm, his gray hair plastered against his forehead while his tired eyes locked directly onto Evelyn. For one terrifying second, nobody moved. Then the man spoke softly. "Evelyn!" Her entire body stiffened. "You," she whispered. Daniel immediately positioned himself protectively in front of Sophie. "Who is this?" The older man looked toward Daniel calmly. "My name is Richard Bennett." Daniel frowned. The name hit him a second later. Bennett. Evelyn looked emotionally shattered now. "That's your brother," Daniel realized. Richard gave a small nod. The storm roared around them while tension tightened painfully in the air. Evelyn stared at him with disbelief and anger. "You told him where I was." Richard shook his head immediately. "No, Tom is dead." Pain crossed Richard's face instantly. "I know." "You let this happen!" "No," Richard said firmly. "I tried to stop it." Daniel didn't trust him for a second. "Convenient timing," he snapped. Richard slowly raised both hands. "If I wanted her dead, I wouldn't have come alone." Lightning illuminated the exhaustion in his face. Unlike Evelyn, Richard Bennett looked exactly like the kind of billionaire. Daniel imagined expensive watch, polished shoes ruined by mud, controlled posture shaped by years of boardrooms and power. But there was something else too. Regret, real regret. Evelyn's voice trembled with fury. "You sat beside those people for years while they poisoned the company." Richard looked directly at her, "and you disappeared instead of fighting them." The words hit hard. Daniel could see guilt flash across Evelyn's face again. Richard stepped closer carefully. "Evelyn, the board moved faster than we expected. Once they realized you had evidence, they panicked. His eyes darkened. They're planning to announce tomorrow morning that you suffered a mental breakdown. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. What? Richard nodded grimly. They've already prepared emergency leadership papers. Once she's declared unstable, control of Bennett International transfers permanently to the board. Evelyn looked horrified. They're erasing me. They're trying to. Rainwater dripped from Richard's coat while thunder rolled overhead again. But they don't know about the drive, he continued quietly. Evelyn tightened her grip on it instinctively. Richard looked toward Daniel then, and they definitely don't know about him. Daniel frowned. Me? Richard nodded slowly. You may be the biggest problem they have now. Daniel laughed bitterly. I'm a broke construction worker. No, Richard said carefully. You're a witness. The realization settled heavily over all of them. Daniel had seen everything. The attacks, the agents, Evelyn undercover. If this ever reached federal investigators or the media, the board's carefully built lies could collapse instantly. Richard motioned toward the SUV. We need to move before more contractors arrive. Daniel hesitated. Evelyn looked deeply conflicted. You trust him? Daniel asked quietly. For a long moment she said nothing. Then finally, he's the only family I have left. They drove through the storm in silence. Sophie eventually fell asleep against Daniel's shoulder from exhaustion while the dark highway stretched endlessly ahead. Beneath flashes of lightning, Richard drove calmly, though tension remained visible in the tightness of his jaw. Evelyn sat beside the window staring into the rain, looking emotionally hollow. Daniel finally broke the silence. So what now? Richard answered without taking his eyes off the road. Tomorrow morning, Bennett International holds its annual executive summit in Dallas. Evelyn looked toward him immediately. They'll all be there. Richard nodded. The entire board, investors, press. Daniel frowned. And Richard glanced at the flash drive in Evelyn's hand. And if those files become public during the summit, the board collapses before they can bury the truth. Evelyn looked uncertain. They'll never let me inside. They don't have a choice, Richard replied quietly. You're still the CEO. A dangerous silence followed. Then Daniel spoke carefully. You really think exposing them fixes this? Richard finally looked at him through the rearview mirror. No, but it starts something. Hours later, they arrived at a quiet lake house hidden deep outside Dallas. While dawn slowly began breaking across the horizon, the storm had weakened into soft rain now, and the world felt eerily calm after the violence of the night before. Inside the house, Sophie slept curled beneath blankets on the couch while Daniel stood near the kitchen watching. Evelyn silently cried beside the window. Not dramatic crying, not loud. The kind people do when they're too exhausted to hold themselves together anymore. Daniel walked closer carefully. You okay? Evelyn laughed softly. Through tears. No. The honesty in her voice hurt to hear. Daniel leaned against the counter. You know, he said quietly, when I first met you, I thought you looked lonely. She wiped her eyes slowly. I was. You still are. Evelyn looked down. All those buildings, all that money, all those people working for me. Her voice cracked slightly, and somehow I still ended up completely alone. Daniel understood that feeling more than she realized. After Melissa died, people had surrounded him for weeks. Neighbors brought food. Co-workers offered condolences. Family called constantly. Then slowly everybody returned to their lives, and grief stayed behind with him. Daniel looked toward sleeping Sophie. She likes you. Evelyn smiled faintly through tears. She reminds me of Lily. The room fell quiet again. Then Evelyn whispered something that surprised even herself. I think meeting your daughter saved me. Daniel looked at her carefully. Evelyn shook her head slightly. You have no idea what it felt like hearing her laugh again, or watching you fight for her even when life gave you every reason to stop trying. Her eyes met his. Your life is harder than mine ever was. Daniel almost laughed at that. You're a billionaire, and you're stronger than I am. The words landed heavily between them. For the first time in years, Evelyn Bennett looked less like a corporate titan and more like a grieving mother who had spent too long hiding inside power because she didn't know how to survive pain any other way. The next morning, America woke up to chaos. News channels exploded with headlines about Evelyn Bennett's disappearance. Analysts speculated endlessly about corporate instability while international stock dropped rapidly before markets even opened. But none of them knew the truth yet. By noon, black luxury vehicles lined the massive glass entrance of the Bennett International Convention Center in downtown Dallas. Reporters crowded outside barricades, while executives hurried through security beneath flashing cameras. Inside, the board prepared to bury Evelyn Bennett forever. until she walked through the front doors herself. The entire lobby froze. Conversations died instantly. Executives turned pale. Cameras swung wildly toward her, and for one breathtaking moment, nobody moved at all. Evelyn walked forward, slowly wearing a simple dark suit. Richard had arranged overnight. No jewelry, no entourage, no mask. Daniel walked beside her, holding Sophie's hand while reporters shouted, questions from every direction. "Ms. Bennett, where have you been? Is the company collapsing? Did you suffer a breakdown?" The board members waiting near the elevator looked horrified. One of them, a tall man named Victor Langley, recovered first. "Evelyn," he said tightly, forcing a fake smile. "Thank God you're safe." Daniel instantly hated him. Evelyn stared directly into his eyes. "Don't." The smile disappeared from Victor's face immediately. Security moved nervously around the lobby while investors whispered in confusion. Then Evelyn turned toward the ballroom entrance where hundreds of executives waited inside, and she walked straight toward the stage. The ballroom buzzed with tension as cameras broadcast live across the country. Daniel stood near the side wall with Sophie while Richard watched silently nearby. Victor stepped toward the microphone first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, "recent events surrounding our CEO have clearly been difficult. Ms. Bennett has endured immense emotional stress." "Stop lying." Evelyn's voice cut through the room like a blade. Complete silence followed. Victor's expression darkened instantly. Evelyn stepped onto the stage slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she looked out across the sea of wealthy executives, investors, reporters, and cameras. Then she spoke. "For years I told myself success justified sacrifice. The room remained perfectly still. I convinced myself growth mattered more than people. Efficiency mattered more than families. Profit mattered more than humanity." Daniel watched emotions ripple across faces throughout the ballroom. Evelyn continued, 3 weeks ago, I disappeared because I wanted to see what my company actually looked like to the people surviving beneath it." Victor stepped forward angrily. "Evelyn, this isn't the place." She ignored him. "I met workers sleeping in cars because they couldn't afford rent, while our executives bought third vacation homes. I met single parents working double shifts without health care. I met people so exhausted they forgot what hope even felt like." Her eyes filled with tears now, and I realized something horrifying. The room leaned into silence. "I built this." Victor's composure finally cracked. "Cut the broadcast," he snapped toward staff. But Richard stepped directly into the control area. "No." Evelyn held up the flash drive. "And when I started investigating why this was happening, members of my own board tried to have me killed." The ballroom exploded into chaos. Reporters shouted. Executives panicked. Security moved frantically. Victor turned pale instantly. "That's absurd!" Evelyn's voice broke with raw emotion now. "An innocent man died protecting evidence proving what you've done." Daniel saw Sophie quietly squeeze his hand tighter. Evelyn looked across the room one final time. Then she said the words that changed everything. "A company is not numbers on a screen. It's human beings. And the moment we forget that," tears rolled openly down her face now, "we become monsters wearing expensive suits." Federal agents entered the ballroom minutes later. Multiple board members attempted to leave. None succeeded. The investigations that followed dominated national headlines for months. Fraud charges, corruption scandals, illegal labor practices, secret offshore accounts. Bennett International became the center of one of the largest corporate criminal investigations in modern American history. But strangely, that wasn't the part people remembered most. What America remembered was the photograph. A single image captured outside a tiny roadside diner in Texas. Evelyn Bennett sitting beside a little girl with a broken pink umbrella, and beside them, a tired construction worker smiling for the first time in years. 6 months later, Daniel stood outside. A newly rebuilt community center funded entirely through Bennett Foundation. Reform programs while children laughed inside the basketball court behind him. Sophie ran through the grass wearing new sneakers, her laughter echoing beneath the warm Texas sunset. Life still wasn't perfect. Grief still existed. Melissa was still gone. But for the first time in years, hope no longer felt impossible. Evelyn walked up beside him quietly. No luxury convoy. No cameras. Just Evelyn. "You know," she said softly, "you changed my life." Daniel smiled faintly. "You were already trying to change." "Maybe," she admitted. "But you reminded me why." Sophie suddenly ran toward them, holding 2 melting ice cream cones. "One for you," she announced proudly to Evelyn. Evelyn accepted it carefully like it was something priceless. Then Sophie asked the question only a child could ask. "Are you still rich?" Daniel nearly choked laughing. But Evelyn smiled warmly. "Yes." Sophie tilted her head curiously. "Then why do you smile more now?" For a moment, Evelyn couldn't answer. She looked toward the crowded community center filled with workers, families, children, ordinary people whose lives had once been invisible to her. Then she looked back at Sophie. "Because," she whispered gently, "I finally remembered what actually matters." And as the Texas sun disappeared slowly beyond the horizon, Daniel realized something profound. Sometimes the people who save us don't arrive like heroes. Sometimes they arrive cold, lost, and standing alone in the rain. The story has reached its complete, emotional ending. Daniel, Sophie, and Evelyn's journey has fully resolved. The mystery was revealed, the emotional payoff happened, and the final life message closed the narrative naturally. If you want, I can also create a brand new cinematic story with another title. A darker thriller version of this concept. A richer, Stelliosum-style rewrite with even heavier emotions and twists. A sequel story continuing Daniel and Evelyn's lives. A YouTube voiceover script version with pacing pauses. Thumbnail text and viral title ideas for this story.